All right, you are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and I am joined today by Professor Pete Enns. Pete, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. And the place I find myself in is right here with you. Isn't that nice?
You're an Old Testament professor. You are an author of several books about the Bible, about theology, and you're a fellow podcaster. You co-host with Jared Bias a podcast called The Bible for Normal People.
Right.
And I have been a listener of that podcast and an admirer of yours for many years. And I emailed you a couple weeks ago because you just published a new book, Curveball. And the subtitle of your book is When Your Faith Takes Turns You Never Saw Coming. So let's just start with the title. What do you mean by curveball?
What I mean by that is just unexpected things that come at us in life, which are happening all the time if we're paying attention. And I don't mean things that are like, oh, that was sort of weird. I mean really disruptive things that affect our whole narratives and how we look at ourselves and how we look at our faith. And these are things that happen to us that are actually not just unavoidable, but necessary for us to be able to grow in faith and to sort of get to know a bigger and better God than the ones we always have carrying around in our heads. So that's a big theme of the book, that our experiences actually affect how we think of God. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. And sometimes it's pain that gets us to that place more quickly. And that's where the curveballs come in. The thing you can't handle, the thing you couldn't handle, you have to adjust to it. And all of a sudden you're thinking differently about God and about Jesus and Christianity and maybe even the Bible. And that's just the path that we're on. I think we're all on that path.
So if we could, let's get a little personal. Will you tell our listeners the story of the curveball that was thrown at you, 8-ish months after you left your teaching position as a Bible teacher, an Old Testament scholar at Westminster Theological Seminary?
The last few years there were a little bit difficult for me for a number of reasons. But when I left, in my official first day of not being employed there was August 1st, 2008. And at first it was just, I felt so free and I wasn't depressed at all. I was doing great. But after about 8 months or so, things just started caving in on me. And I was not, that's a big curveball. I mean, I wasn't expecting it to happen that way. I thought I had a pretty good handle on this stuff. But the bottom line was, I had been in a setting, and I think a lot of people listening can relate to this. I had been in a setting where what you believe is pretty much laid out for you. There's a doctrinal statement, and conservative Calvinists happen to have a doctrinal statement that's like 33 chapters long. It's called the Westminster Confession of Faith. It's a lot to wrap your head around. But there you have it. So you had this. I had this statement of faith that we signed every year, and I meant it, but I also wasn't allowing myself. I think I only saw this later on. I wasn't allowing myself deep down to interrogate my faith at all. And what I did not, I wanted my freedom. I didn't want to be told what to think anymore. But there's a price that comes with that, which is no one's telling you what to think anymore. So you have to think for yourself. And I had this moment, which was a culmination of several weeks of just, that nagging sense that you're going to throw up, and you try to hold it down, and then all of a sudden, I just can't hold it anymore. Just you vomit all over the floor. That's sort of what happened to me spiritually. I was standing in my bedroom, and I just said to myself, I don't know what I believe anymore. I have no idea. I mean, all the guardrails were off, and I was on my own. And I felt as if, a voice inside of me, which I like to interpret as the Spirit inside of me, saying, well, Pete, you got what you wanted. Now what? I'm like, heck if I know. I don't know what I'm going to do. So it started I'd say about a year-long period of my just not knowing where any of this was going to go. And it was extremely unsettling. It was a true, the overused term, it was a true deconstruction moment for me. And it was very serious. And it wasn't cool and sexy and, oh, this is so awesome. I was numb. This was completely out of my control. I had no control over what was going on. I just had to go along for the ride. So that is a moment that I can't say everything started there, because I talk in the book about earlier experiences, but that was a crystallizing moment for me that really did start me on a very different path.
And let's just be clear, like for you at that time, you were teaching, equipping, instructing in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, pastors.
Right.
And so for you to have that moment in your bedroom, like that's a big deal for everyone, for anyone, but it's an especially big deal for someone who has spent so much time and energy in biblical studies and in teaching and equipping pastors and scholars in Old Testament.
Right. What this experience did for me, though, and again, I wonder if people can relate to this, is that eventually, almost like the clock turned back 20 years to a point where I was about to embark on going to seminary. I went because I just had a lot of curiosity. I just really wanted to understand. And I didn't care what I found. I just wanted to understand as best as I could. And my student years at Westminster were actually they were enlightening years. I mean, I was young. I was in my mid-20s, and I didn't know anything. And I had good teachers who pushed us to, many of them to basically follow the evidence.
You used the term deconstruction for what you were describing, but as I hear you talk about your experience in the context of that word deconstruction, what I hear is confession. Confess in the Greek, homologeo, homo, sameness, legeo, speaking. It's simply to speak sameness with God about what is true. And in your bedroom that day, you let your being say out loud a confession. I don't know what I believe anymore. That was actually an act of confession.
I agree with that. Yeah. And I think God values our honesty more than just playing the game. And that's why I shudder to think, had I stayed there, this is not a comment at anybody else at Westminster, but had I stayed there, there's a very good chance I would have spent my entire life without that moment of confession, because the pressure is too big to stay on the beach blanket.
So I want to read what I think is a very important sentence from the prologue to your book, Curveball. And this sentence is actually a confession of yours. It's a public confession. And here's what you say. The big lesson I learned from wrestling with my own curveballs is how deeply my faith in God had been cemented in fear, which is to say, how I viewed God as very much antagonistic toward me. Now, boy, is that a profound confession. What do you mean, Pete, when you say that you realized your relationship with God was driven largely by fear?
The fear of getting God wrong. And that meant, implicitly, that meant adhering to a specific system of doctrines that were a part of that conservative Calvinist world. And I just to pause here for a second, I'm not like anti-doctrine or anything. I think just when you talk about Christianity, and anytime you have a belief that you want to state, you're in the world of doctrine at that point, and I'm not against it. But there is a difference between holding on to doctrine, tooth and nail, or holding on to it more gently, maybe with a sense of curiosity, knowing that because of the limited nature of our human experience and that God is always out ahead of us, we're going to change our points of view. That's just the way it's going to be. And, that was part of that too. It was a fear that if you're wrong about God, what is God going to think of you? You think of God as sort of a paternal figure up there looking down on you, very disappointed in you. And if you don't get it together, there are going to be some you're not going to like it. So just, you've got to learn to color in between the lines and not move away from that. And that's the kind of fear that I'm talking about. And that makes the life of faith extremely stressful.
Yes, and let me go right back to the prologue, because after confessing that your faith in God had largely been driven by fear, here's what you write. You say, as a result, any thought of listening to my experiences was seen as a crisis that had to be averted.
Mm-hmm.
Now, boom, like there it is. What you did in that sentence is you said a bad word, and the bad word is experiences.
Oh, yeah.
In the conservative evangelical circles that I grew up in, that word experience is viewed with immense suspicion and frankly contempt.
Hostility.
What do you mean when you write any thought of listening to my experiences was seen as a crisis that had to be averted?
I remember hearing as a seminary student, and also just on the faculty, and also in church context, it's not just, where I worked, that your intuition, your experiences, well, you're sinful. So those just get in the way. If there's any experience you have that causes you to question pure doctrine, that is a sinful thought that you have, and you want to get rid of that. And your intuitions and your thinking are subject to either the devil's attacks or just your own sinfulness, and you need to hold that at bay. And the way to do that is to adhere to the system of doctrine that you're given. And of course, the great irony in this is that there's no sense at all from some of these people that that's also a highly subjective, experiential, even intuitive engagement with the text and with the Christian tradition to have this system of doctrine. That's why, again, I don't mind a system of doctrine as long as it's understood. Folks, we're talking about God here. We're just doing our best.
You have a chapter in your book that I think is based on an episode of your podcast, episode 189, which you titled Faith in the New Normal. I want to talk about this episode of your podcast, The Bible for Normal People. It's a solo episode where you're doing a lot of confessing, basically. And you say some very important things. And I want to state your claims, and then we're going to break it down and talk about it.
Okay.
The first claim you make on that episode is that our understanding of God needs to change as we grow. Okay. That's a claim. Not everyone agrees with that. That's your first claim. Second, you claim that it is our experiences in life which prompt that process of growth. And here's how you put it. You say beliefs, doctrines, beliefs, thoughts, which used to serve us come up short. Why? Because something happens.
Right.
And those two words, I think, are so important in the life of faith. Something happens. And let me quote you a couple more sentences and then we can unpack it. Here's what you say. Rethinking your beliefs about God can be painful for many people because we have been taught that the essence of faith is hanging on to our doctrinal beliefs for dear life. Few of us have been taught to expect that our experiences should challenge our beliefs over the course of our lives. We have been taught, rather, to see our experiences as dangers rather than as a summons to grow. Okay. Unpack these three sentences, Pete. Beliefs which used to serve us come up short. Why? Because something happens. What do you mean?
I mean, just as an example, and this is an example that many, many people have had, as maybe you're growing up, you leave to go to college and you've been a part of a church community that, even if no one would admit it, might have been very sheltered. And it was very clear boundaries between the good guys and the bad guys. And then you go off to college, and even a Christian college. I mean, we experience this at Eastern University all the time. Students come from maybe more traditional backgrounds, and their roommates are not traditional Christians. They're very, very different kinds of Christians. And that's like a crisis moment for these young people. And you start questioning, boy, these boundaries lines were drawn thick with a 2-foot cement wall, and I'm just watching it crumble in front of me. that belief that I was taught, my inherited faith, is not adequate for handling the fact that this roommate doesn't believe in hell, or this roommate is okay with gay people, or this roommate is gay. Your narrative is being challenged, and it's your experiences are not adequate up to that point for addressing this. So this is a new experience. This is a curveball. I didn't go into graduate school as a fundamentalist by any stretch of the imagination, and with people from around the world in my little department, and they're like nice people.
That's right.
You can't demonize them. And I didn't want to. And I liked them. I hung out with them, had lunch with them. They could watch my kids. They were, little kids at the time. And I started thinking about, okay, what does God think of these people? And I began realizing how arrogant that question even was to state that way. The doctrine of eternal punishment, because people couldn't check off the same boxes that I was checking off, I couldn't imagine God being like that. Well, that's your problem, Pete. You're using your imagination. No, what are we? Theology isn't an imaginative discipline. There's imagination involved in theology. Walter Brueggemann talks about that too. It's like you can't get around our minds just going and thinking and imagining and putting pieces together as best as we can. And that's what I was doing at that moment. Those experiences that I had drove me to that. Now, my option was to bury my experiences and just keep on going with my inherited faith. But that lands you in therapy eventually, which isn't a bad place to go, by the way. I'm just saying that you're creating a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance.
So I want to make this super immensely practical. You give an example in that episode that I liked so much of the Bible for Normal People, episode 189. You tell a story about a man named Rob Portman. He is a conservative Republican senator from Ohio. He was a member of the House from 93 to 2005. Then he was elected to the Senate in 2011. And while Rob Portman was in Congress, he supported a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage. Mm-hmm. He also voted for a bill prohibiting gay couples from adopting children in D.C. Mm-hmm. In short, he was very firm in his convictions that homosexuality was wrong.
Right.
But then something happened.
Right.
In 2013, 2 years into his senatorial term, Rob Portman's son came out as gay. And within 2 days of his son coming out, Senator Portman very publicly reversed his position on gay marriage. And here's what he said in his press release. I have opposed same-sex marriage my entire career, but then something happened that led me to think through my position in a much deeper way. I love those two words, something happened. Now, Pete, why is that story meaningful to you? Like, why did you share that story in your podcast episode?
It's such a clear, concrete, and brief example of exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about in the book. You have a belief system, you have values that you adhere to honestly. It's not just that Bob Portman's view on human sexuality changed. His view of God changed. Because what God was opposed to 2 days earlier, God is no longer opposed to, in his opinion. So his view of God actually changed. And to me, that's exactly it. And with me, it's having classmates, at Harvard, and it's that changed me, and all sorts of experiences I've had, and I recount a number of them in the book that have changed how I think. And darn it all, if you can look at Portman and say, well, you just didn't hold on to the right doctrine, and you just caved into the world, or you're a wolf in sheep's clothing, or you're going down the slippery slope. That just seems like silly at some point. It's like, no, you're trying to make me deny something that is happening deep inside of me. And here's the thing that people don't always consider. Maybe that cognitive dissonance that he probably felt is one way that God actually speaks to us. He wasn't looking to be, I want to be sort of sexy and cool and be progressive and deconstruct, all that kind of stuff. He's like, I'm sure he was like, oh crap. I can't imagine he was like happy about this at first. And I'm sure he had fallout. I mean, tons of fallout from his constituents and from family members, right? And this was a hard thing for him to do. Not an easy thing, very hard to do, but he did it because, he loves his son. And he looked and he said, I know my son is being authentic here and trusted me to tell me something. And I don't believe that I'm caving into evil here by supporting my son. And I agree with that.
I went to Candler School of Theology, and I took every class that Luke Timothy Johnson taught. Adore Luke Timothy Johnson. First of all, you got to understand, I was a conservative, evangelical, PCA guy, Presbyterian guy, and Luke Johnson's a Catholic, so he was already suspect in my mind. But I remember the day when I realized that this man knows his New Testament in Greek better than I know mine in English, and I knew mine very well in English.
Yeah.
And I bring Luke Johnson up because he was the first person that opened my eyes to what you have really written a lot about. And here's how he did it. Before he was at Candler, he was a professor at Yale. One of his assignments to his New Testament students was to ask them to write their story, their life narrative, through the lens of how their faith has changed, how they came to faith, how it's evolved. And there were 60 students in his class. 15 to 20 of them came out to him as gay in those stories.
Wow. Okay.
Now, he was not, at that time, he was not open to homosexuality as a valid way of being human or being Christian. But here's what he taught us. As he read the stories, he realized that these were stories of faithfulness. These were stories of young men and women who had a deep love for Jesus and who also had a sexual orientation that was different than the mainstream. But his whole point in teaching us about this and telling us this story was that holiness is always the mark of whether something is true and right and good. But in these stories, as he read them, he realized that these were stories of holiness. Now, my guess is, I don't know, Senator Rob Portman, my guess is as he talked to his son, he had a similar experience.
Yeah.
That this son of mine is not living in rebellion to God, but in faithfulness to God.
Right.
It was moving to me that you shared this story both in the book and in the podcast because it reminded me of Luke Johnson. All right, let's transition a little bit because you do something very bold in chapters 9 and 10. You take the risk as a theology guy of writing some sentences about quantum physics. I want to focus on just one of the points you share in these two chapters, and this is what's called the principle of non-locality. Now, just listeners, bear with me. We're going to break this down. This is very moving to me. I'm going to summarize this term, and then I just want to ask you something about it, Pete, okay? So first, a very short primer on quantum physics. Quantum physics is the study of the small, the very, very, very small. Subatomic particles. We're talking about very small things, protons, electrons, neutrons, and more accurately, the tinier particles that make that stuff up. So scientists have taken one of those extremely small particles and split it into two particles. So now you've got two particles in a lab, let's just say in Los Angeles. And when the scientists in LA make particle A spin in a clockwise direction, suddenly particle B starts spinning counterclockwise. Now, so far, this is no big deal, okay? So far, everything is behaving according to the laws of Newtonian physics. But some scientist had the utterly absurd idea of taking particle B from the lab in LA and putting it in a lab in Tokyo. And the scientist in Tokyo called the scientist in LA and said, hey, give particle A clockwise spin. And lo and behold, particle B, way across the globe, immediately started spinning counterclockwise. Now, This is a mind-blowing, massive problem, by which I mean an utter delight. An utter delight. This phenomenon is known as the principle of non-locality. And here's what you point out in the book. There is no way for classical physicists to explain how two particles can be non-local, that is, not right next to each other, thousands of miles apart, and immediately affect one another.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just ask you personally, Pete, like, why does non-locality move you? Why do you care? Why did you risk writing sentences about it in your book?
One of the laws of physics, and it is a law of physics, that nothing can go faster than the speed of light. So if you have these two particles removed from each other at a distance, and see, mathematically, it's not like just thousands of miles apart. This can be on opposite sides of the galaxy, on opposite sides of the universe even. And mathematically, this has been shown and it's been supported by experiments. This is a fact. This is not an idea. This is something that's been demonstrated, and it took a long time to get to that point. You're dealing with an issue here that is impossible. That's the bottom line. And I think, what a nice, weird universe we live in, where we can't even figure out our reality, and then we're trying to figure out God. Now, I think, quantum physicists are going to figure out how non-locality works. The universe here is telling us something, that mystery is a core concept that we have to learn to live with.
And connectedness.
Yes, and connectedness as well, because how can this happen? And one of the big things in quantum physics is that very notion of connectedness, that there are no things that are isolated from anything else. Everything is connected to everything.
And here's why I love the principle of non-locality. And frankly, here's why it's germane to this podcast. Non-locality shows us that the world is filled with far more wonder than we thought.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know how you can sit with the reality of non-locality. That thing about the particle in San Francisco, LA, and the particle in Tokyo, and not feel that sensation of wonder and awe inside your body.
Right.
The primary thing to take away, in my mind, from the principle of non-locality is this: we are far more connected than we realize. Matter in this world is far more connected than any of us realized.
Yeah. These subatomic particles are still matter. They're still things that make up the universe that are connected, deeply connected. And these connections are always, they're bigger than the sum of their parts. They bring us something, I'm just going to say miraculous. It's beautiful. It's fantastic. It's unbelievable. And, my understanding of God has changed as a result, because I can't imagine God, and I haven't for a very long time. This is not a new thing, but a bearded guy up there looking down, even though that is how some of the biblical story portrays God. Not all of it, but it's there. It's a part of it, and understandably so, right? The cosmos is limited. God has a throne. He's sitting up there. But I can't see how we can even talk about God being anywhere, like in a particular galaxy, behind a star. Like, where is God? God has to be everywhere. But I think all things have that divine energy and that divine presence in them, including all people, right? So, and that, if that doesn't say something about our interconnectedness.
The word you're getting at here is the word relationality. And in chapter 10, you claim, very short sentence, you simply write, relationality is at the core of reality. And then you go on to say that it's also at the core of God's nature. And here's how you put it: both the creator and the creation are relational. The creation reflects our relational creator.
Right. And that's, mimicking Trinitarian language. And I think of, the Trinitarian interrelationship as the three together in relation are God. And that's a relation that is a relation of love and intimacy. And the universe as a whole is sort of an explosion of that relationality in the nature of God. And so it's no surprise that the creation reflects relationality if the creator is relationality, right?
And, this discussion of the Trinity reminds me that Richard Rohr points out that the reason we have a hard time understanding the doctrine of the Trinity is because we begin with the individual persons rather than beginning with the relationship.
Hmm.
The way Rohr says to think about it, he says, in the beginning was the relationship, and the relationship was with God, and the relationship was God. He says, look, start with the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Don't start with the three as separate entities. Years ago, you wrote a book. I alluded to it earlier, but I want to ask you a question about it. It's called The Sin of Certainty. And the subtitle of that book is, I love the subtitle, Why God Desires Our Trust More Than Our Correct Beliefs. I recently did a podcast episode on this podcast called Trauma, Fragmentation, and the Soothing Certainty of Dogmatism.
Oh, okay.
And I know that's a mouthful, but I want to just share my thesis from that episode, and I just want to get your reaction.
Okay, sure.
I want to get a biblical scholar's kind of reaction. Here's point one. The point one, trauma is my field, so trauma leads to fragmentation in the brain. We know that.
Yes.
Point two is that when you've got high levels of fragmentation in your brain, you're going to feel unstable inside.
Yes.
Point three is that because of that felt sense of instability, you will feel, and this was my story, you will feel a tremendous pull toward theologies and worldviews that offer you certainty.
Right.
And then as a result, point four, the fragmentation in your brain, especially if you have trauma, can make you a very dogmatic person.
Mm-hmm.
And I quote Dan Allender in that episode. He says that the more certain you become, the less fragmented you feel.
Yes. Yeah. It's a safe place.
It's a safe place. So here's my question for you, Pete. Like, as you look back on your life, do you remember feeling pulled to theologies, worldviews that offered you certainty? And if so, why? Why do you think you were drawn to certainty earlier in your life?
Well, yeah, I think I was. There was always a part of me that held back, though, from being totally sold out to something. And I think this is my personality type. But I liked the stability and the structure and the lack of mystery, frankly, of, a particular brand of Calvinism. It's very attractive and it makes you feel at home. I think I was probably attracted to that. Feeling like you have a handle on ultimate reality is a very comforting thing.
Well, Pete, I am super grateful for your generosity of time and being with me today to talk about where your faith journey has taken you. The book that you've written is called Curveball, When Your Faith Takes Turns You Never Saw Coming. Folks, if you've enjoyed listening to Pete, you can pick up a copy of Curveball. And he's got a lot of other books. This is what, number 6 or 7, Pete?
Actually, it's probably closer to 20 because I've written other kinds of books too. But in terms of books that I think people can actually read, this is probably like 5 or 6 now. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Pete.
Yeah, sure, Adam. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.